Good evening, everyone. Thank you. It looks like we have 46 people in the audience, including myself, and so that's really great that that many people decided to log on to Zoom to hear me talk tonight. I'm very thankful to the Ottoman Society of St. Paul for inviting me. And so welcome to my talk, which is entitled Dominant Science and Indigenous Peoples. And I'm going to, of course, explain exactly what dominant science is and how it's interfaced with Indigenous peoples, and how Indigenous peoples have managed to find our own way into scientific structures and have pushed for Indigenous science to be viewed as a worthy type of way of doing science on its own. So my name is I'm Deondre. I'm Deondre Smiles. My Ojibwe name, which you might notice here before my English name, is Niiyokamigaabaw, which means stands on 4 layers of the earth. That's my Ojibwe name, and I try to go by that professionally. Yeah, so welcome to my talk. What I usually like to do is I try to keep a pretty casual sort of vibe for my talks. I've been to enough academic talks in my lifetime already where you go in and you see the person, they talk and they don't really look away from their slides, and it's very almost monotone in like their delivery, and you're falling asleep. Or maybe that's just me, but I try to not do things like that. And so I usually start out by telling a little bit about myself so that you can get to know me and understand a little bit of where I come from. So as Martha mentioned, I'm an assistant professor here in the Department of Geography at the University of Victoria, which is located on Lekwungen-speaking and Songhees Esquimalt and WSÁNEĆ lands, otherwise known as Greater Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. I've been up here since the summer of 2021 when I moved up from the United States and took up a job here in Canada. Kind of my educational background, which I didn't put here, is that, as Martha mentioned, yes, I'm from Minneapolis originally. I grew up on the South Side. Was part of one of the first generations of my family to actually not graduate from South High School in Minneapolis. I graduated from Osseo in 2008. And then from there went on and did a bachelor's degree in geography from St. Cloud State University from 2008 to 2013. I took a bit of a gap year to figure out what I wanted to do as far as graduate school. Went off and did a master's degree in global Indigenous studies from the University of Minnesota, Duluth. And then after that, moved out to Columbus, Ohio, where I did a PhD in geography at Ohio State for 4 years from 2016 to 2020, where I also stuck around for a year as a postdoctoral scholar in the Department of History. From there, I applied for this job at UVic and I got it and moved up here. A little bit kind of other information about myself. I'm a citizen of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, Bullhead Clan. And so, yep, I still have family up there at Leech Lake, particularly in the Cass Lake and Bena Ryan's Village areas. I also serve on the board of trustees of our tribal college up there, Leech Lake Tribal College. And so that's the main way how I manage to stay connected to my homelands. As far as the work that I do, I have a number of different research interests. I find it really hard to kind of define myself as in one way or another, just because I really enjoy doing all kinds of various things. If you ask people, the one thing that they'll say about me is that I'll generally agree to do any project that I find fascinating, which has led me to some really interesting connections with people in disciplines as wide-ranging as history to medicine, to archaeology, to environmental studies, to sociology, and even media studies and writing studies and literature. As a matter of fact, my first teaching gig was to teach a freshman writing studies at the University of Minnesota, Duluth when I was in my master's degree. But I have to define myself as being interested in something for grant applications and, when I give talks like this. And so I define that as kind of my areas of interest as critical Indigenous geographies, or kind of understanding the way that power and colonialism play into Indigenous relationships with space, human-environment interactions, or the ways that we relate to the environment, the ways that we act upon the environment, and the way that the environment acts upon us and guides how we move through space, and science and technology studies, which is pretty relevant for what we're talking about tonight. The kind of current research that I do, I define it as the political ecologies and economies of space of Indigenous death. And what do I mean by that is I mean that places like burial sites, burial grounds, and even the concept of Indigenous death has become a source of contestation between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples over how to treat Indigenous bodies after death, what to do with Indigenous bodies, how to treat Indigenous burial sites. We'll talk about that a little bit in the talk tonight. But I also work on Indigenous cultural and political responses to climate change and climate crisis, which is also a very deeply scientific field if there ever was one. And so I'll also chat about that a little bit tonight as well. Outside of academia, of course, because I believe in a strong work-life balance, I do many other things as well. The picture on the left-hand side is my spouse, Abigail, and myself. Abigail is a fellow alumnus of St. Cloud State, UMD in Ohio State. We actually met when we were both at Duluth at the same time. Both avid musicians. That's actually a picture of us at a pep band alumni gig at Osseo back in January that I went to up there at the high school in the hockey arena. The picture on the right-hand side is another kind of testament to my my love of music. When I was a postdoctoral scholar, I actually had the opportunity to audition for the Ohio State University Marching Band, or the best damn band in the land. So I spent a season as a member of the cymbal section in that band. And then the picture in the middle is our dear cat, Ash, which we adopted in January after our previous cat passed away. These things kind of take up a lot of my life outside of academia, but I also really enjoy being in the great outdoors. A big fan of hiking along the Pacific Ocean. I actually posted a picture and somebody confused it with Lake Superior, which was kind of cool. And I think maybe why I really enjoy being in Victoria. But that's a little bit about me. I always say as a geographer, I have to include an obligatory map in any of the talks that I give. And so there's a map of the Leech Lake Reservation. Like, I call South Minneapolis home, but also Leech Lake is home to me. And so the nice thing about talking to folks in Minnesota is that I don't have to like preface this by saying, oh, well, here is Minneapolis and St. Paul right here, right? You know where those are, hopefully. And then here's Leech Lake up here. So that is where home is for me. I'm really fortunate, and the reason why I'm really passionate about Indigenous science is that I get to run my own lab here in the geography departments. And so I'm the principal investigator of the Geographic Indigenous Futures Collaboratory here at the University of Victoria, which is a lab that focuses on highlighting Indigenous responses to climate change, as well as challenges to political and cultural sovereignty in Indigenous communities in both the United States and in Canada. So I have a lot of longstanding relationships with nations, including my own back in the US, back in Minnesota, but also starting to build relationships up here on the West Coast with a number of First Nations here in Canada and Indigenous nations just across the border from us in Washington State. So that is kind of a bit about me. That's usually more than I talk about myself in any kind of given setting. So there you are. I do want to give a couple of obligatory disclaimers before we get started with the talk. And one of those is this is an Indigenous humor zone. I talk about some heavy stuff in the work that I do, both in teaching and in research. And we're going to talk about some heavy stuff tonight. And so I try to lighten the mood a little bit with some humor wherever I can, obviously done tastefully and appropriately, right? But I will tell some jokes and tell some stories and tell some kind of side anecdotes. And so be aware of that. Also a bit of a content warning, especially for Indigenous folks that may be in the talk, or for folks that might be watching this via recording, is that I do talk a little bit about the Indigenous dead, particularly debates around repatriation of Indigenous remains. I don't show any remains. I'm not showing any skeletons. I don't show any burial sites, but I do talk about it. And so if this is something that you might be sensitive about, just a warning that this is coming. What I might do is I might flag that I'm about to talk about it and the slide before. Give me a couple of minutes, and then you'll probably be safe to reconnect. So just wanted to let you all know about that. I know that somebody just came in the waiting room. As my host mentioned, if you have questions during the talk, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I may not always see them, but I'll occasionally just check. I teach via Zoom in my classes anyways, the vast majority of them. And so I'm used to kind of scanning the chat function for questions and answers. But of course, we'll also take time after the talk for questions and answers if you feel comfortable kind of talking then. And I'll also give you my contact information if you're like me. And don't think of your questions until about an hour or two after the talk has ended. So take a quick sip of water here and we will get started. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to define what exactly I mean by dominant science. So for the longest time, when we talked about science in Indigenous circles, and we talked about like how to define science as it is done in universities and in colleges and in research structures today, for the longest time, we talked about it as Western science, right? Because we conflated it with kind of Western values, with European kind of mindsets and mentalities. But scholars such as Maxi Baron, who you'll actually hear from a little bit later tonight, and other Indigenous scholars have actually kind of pushed back against kind of this definition. And they've said, well, first of all, how do you define Western science? And it's not really just Western science that could be considered to be dominant, but really what we're talking about when we push back against quote Western science is we're talking about systems of disseminating science that are based in unequal power structures that are stacked against Indigenous peoples. And they said, well, that's important, right? Is there something inherently Western about that? And so what they've kind of pivoted towards talking about, and how I pivoted towards talking about this now, is we view it more as dominant science, right? Because it's a form of doing science, it's a way of doing science that has taken on a dominant role and a dominant power imbalance towards Indigenous peoples in our own lifeways and our cultures, right? So that's one kind of key definition of dominant science. One of the things that absolutely bothers me, that I can't stand it when people talk about this, is they say, well, science is apolitical, right? That science is neutral, science is unassailable, science is science. Science is not apolitical, right? That is one of the biggest fallacies that we can talk about when we talk about how to do science, right? Is that science is tied up with politics, right? Like the ways that science is valued, the way that science is practiced, the way that people have access to do science, to get data from science, right? It is tied up in structures of power and of hegemony. It is not neutral. I remember as a young master's student, I was talking with my advisor and I was talking about doing a data analysis. And I made the mistake of saying, well, you know, like a data analysis, like data is impartial, right? And they told me data is not impartial. And as I grew to understand more of kind of the history of science with Indigenous peoples, I've come to realize that this is 100% the case, right? That science is not neutral. When we talk about doing science, when we talk about why the scientific process is important and such a key way of doing academic work, of doing research, of doing any kind of knowledge production, we often talk about terms such as objectivity, right? Like the idea of being able to look at something without biases, without any kind of preconceived notions, to evaluate it on its own merit, right? As well as empiricism of the things that we can directly observe, right? It's like if I were to drop this cup onto the ground here, it would fall, maybe bounce once, maybe, and then spill all over the floor. And I could make then an empirical observation that when I drop the cup, right, it is going to spill the contents, the water that I need to drink during the talk, all over this carpet, right? We view objectivity and empiricism similarly to the concept of science as apolitical and neutral, right? Because we say, well, what can be possibly not neutral about what we observe, right? But these things are not inert, politically lifeless terms, right? Similarly, they're not apolitical. The ways that we view objectivity, the empirical observations that we view as important, right? These dictate what we view as important when producing knowledge. We dictate what is valuable, right? What is worthy of being viewed as scientific or rigorous. Let me give one example here. So my very first academic job interview, I got flown out to another university here in Western Canada that I'll leave nameless. And I gave my research talk, I gave my teaching demonstration. It was all things considered, a very, very good interview. During my research talk, and I was talking through my dissertation work, I mentioned that I follow a practice where I don't name the communities that I work with in specific projects. I don't name participants, that I follow a very, very strict process of anonymity. And I said that I do so because I want to protect the communities that I work with from extractive knowledge production, right? That I don't, I was talking about Indigenous death, and these were really deeply culturally sensitive things. And the last thing that I wanted to have happen, and the last thing that the community wanted to have happen, would be for folks to read about the community in a journal publication or a book and decide that, oh, hey, I'm going to go up there and I'm going to do some research myself right on these things. And so I kind of explained that I was looking out for the safety of the community. And I remember after the research talk, there's a period in academic job interviews where you go around and generally you'll meet with faculty who do similar work to what you're doing. And I met with a fellow that was a former head of the department. And he told me, well, Deondre, this was a really, really good talk. I really appreciated the work that you're doing. Like, this is clearly a really important project and something that is that fits well with kind of the scope of our department. But I have a small bone to pick with you. And of course, me being on a job interview, I certainly didn't have room to get defensive. So I was like, sure. Well, what kind of questions do you have? And he said, when you talked about not naming your sources of data, right? The interviews that you were carrying out and the people that you were talking to, in true rigorous science, you would never be allowed to obscure your sources of data like that. And I remember just kind of sitting there, and of course I have a smile, I'm nodding and trying to smile through like the clear kind of, discomfort that I was feeling. And I'm like, well, true rigorous science to whom, right? Like, who's defining what rigorous science is? Is community safety that much less important than me naming where I got the data from, right? It's like, sure, okay, maybe that's true science where we're not obscuring our data, sources, but where does community safety fit in, right? Where do the stories that people are telling me that are deeply impactful to them, where does that fit into this kind of work, right? Where is the heart in the science that we're trying to do? And so it's been something that has really kind of stuck with me ever since. And fortunately, I've been really lucky to have a number of amazing Indigenous mentors who have kind of helped me to think through this and to be able to kind of stand on my own 2 feet and say, well, this is what Indigenous science has to say about this, right? And here's why, our science is just as valid. Okay. How are we doing? No questions in the chat so far? Sweet. All right, so another term that I want to introduce to you all, and that term is settler colonialism. So what is settler colonialism? Well, I teach a course on this. I could talk about this for like 50 one-hour lectures in a row, right? But y'all don't want to sit through that, and I don't want to keep you from your suppers this time of night. And so I'll do the quick definition, right? Settler colonialism is a form of colonization that is based around the occupation or seizure of land from its indigenous inhabitants to be replaced by settlers, right? And so when we talk about settler colonialism, we really kind of center around kind of 2 main kind of schools of thought. And those schools of thought are terra nullius and manifest destiny. Let me further explain. So terra nullius is a Latin term that means no man's land. It means that essentially the land is empty, that it is there for the taking by anybody who is willing to claim it. Manifest destiny is another term that is really kind of American specific, and I think informed settler colonialism in Canada and as well, which describes kind of the idea that it was the God-given and God-ordained right of American settlers, of Canadian settlers, to spread across the North American continent and claim land in the name of the United States or claim land in the name of the Crown. The picture on the right-hand side here is actually a painting entitled Manifest Destiny, and it's a bit cut off here because of the design of the slide. But you'll notice that the figure here, kind of this angelic figure who's holding a book that says knowledge on it, is kind of floating over these settlers moving westward, right? Of stagecoaches with covered wagons on foot, with oxen pulling plows and with horses. And you see kind of telegraph wires kind of behind Manifest Destiny, and you see trains. A little bit out of frame of this photo, you'll see a bustling port, right? And if you take a look at the left side of the painting, or at least the side that we can see here, you see Indigenous peoples kind of moving away, right? Kind of almost fleeing to the west. You see wild animals fleeing. There's some bison here. Here you can't really see it. There's a bear kind of moving and kind of looking back at the settlers, kind of like menacingly, like, how dare you push me away? This is kind of the idea, right? That settlements meant progress, and that Indigenous peoples were to be pushed as far west as possible and then eventually genocided out of existence, whether that was through physical genocide or through the gradual assimilation of Indigenous peoples into American settler culture, right? We see a similar kind of depiction here, well, with the state seal of Minnesota, which is on its way out, right? Where we see kind of the farmer, the settler, kind of with a plow, kind of with a gun nearby, kind of warily watching this native person on horseback who seems to be kind of riding away. A big reason why the state of Minnesota wanted to replace that. This all kind of comes out of this idea of manifest destiny. Canada and the United States are examples of settler colonies, or what we refer to as states that were formed through settler colonialism. There are others, of course, right? And don't want to get fully into like the full list of what this looks like here, but that's a quick definition of what settler colonialism is. And the reason why I bring that up is because it really ties heavily into kind of the ways that dominant science has functioned here in the United States, particularly. So I want to take a second here and kind of show you how settler colonialism kind of functions from a geographic standpoint here through another map. I feel like I say this all the time. I did not create this map. One of these things when I ever, in my abundant free time that I and my grad students in my lab have, maybe we might remake this map. But it kind of shows the gradual cession of land from Indigenous peoples in most of the United States. You'll notice that it kind of doesn't quite cover the eastern seaboard as well as Texas. One of my main quibbles with the map, but it does show Minnesota, right? It kind of shows from approximately the 1780s, early 1800s to the present day, right? And we'll go through this a couple more times just to show you just how rapid this land dispossession progressed. One more time, and then we'll move on to another slide. Another key set of concepts that are important when we talk about the ways that dominant science has interacted with Indigenous peoples are the concepts of eugenics, of race, and of genomics. And so eugenics is a pseudoscientific concept or school of thought where the idea was that desirable traits or human traits that were viewed as desirable to a group of people could and should be passed on to future generations. About 100 years ago, eugenics was all the rage in the United States in particular, Minnesota especially. If you went to the Minnesota State Fair in the 1920s, if you were to go back in 1924, instead of eating Pronto Pops and cheese curds on the Midway, you might instead be attending a eugenics competition where families of white Minnesotans displayed themselves and kind of put on an exhibition to show which white family had the most desirable traits. It sounds, if you think, hey, that kind of sounds kind of really weird, like, you know, it sounds almost like dog breeding or things like that. This was the same school of thought. The idea was that you could find ways to pass on the best traits of yourself onto your children, who would then hopefully be raised up to become strong, well-rounded human beings themselves, who would then pass their traits on to future generations. This had very, very racialized implications, right? Like I kind of foreshadowed. The idea, particularly among settler populations, was that during the early 1900s, this was a period where the United States was beginning to allow in immigrants from other countries. And there was a feeling that kind of white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant American identity was under siege. I see something in the chat here, and so I'm going to, Judy says they called it Fit Family Contest. Yep, exactly. The idea was that, you know, kind of ideas of kind of moral and physical fitness, kind of a bit of a reading of Charles Darwin, right? And the kind of misguided theory of like the survival of the fittest, which actually that was not what Darwin meant by what he was talking about, right? But yeah, there's this idea, right, that white Americans were under siege, and that they needed to make sure that they were raising strong generations so that they could protect themselves from kind of this besiegement by non-white Americans, by Indigenous peoples, by less desirable, quote, populations from Europe, things that heavily informed, theories such as, the Nazis' final solution, for example. Another kind of similar kind of parallel kind of track too was the idea that indigenous peoples were kind of on the decline. And so this was something where white Americans kind of positioned themselves as being, well, this is clearly an example that we are the superior civilization, right? But also kind of similarly kind of an idea of like, oh, those native folks are disappearing, right? We had better try to find ways to preserve their culture before they vanish completely, right? And then we won't be able to learn anything further about them. And so I want to put a pin in that because we're going to come back to that here in a few minutes, right? The idea of cleanliness was a major component of eugenics, right? So beyond kind of this idea of the quote survival of the fittest, there was also kind of a parallel movement in the United States of sanitation and kind of the attempted eradication of, deadly diseases. And part of the sanitation kind of movement centered on folks that were viewed as, quote, unclean by white Americans. For example, the kind of current kind of idea of securitizing the southern US-Mexican border came out of the idea that back in the early 20th century, it was possible up to a certain point to just be able to cross the border openly. But the idea, there was a number of, infectious diseases, outbreaks of infectious diseases in the early 20th century, and Americans blamed it on Mexican migrants. And they said, well, we need to install sanitation stations at the border. We need to make sure that these immigrants are clean. That's where health checks came at Ellis Island, for example, as well as Angel Island on the West Coast. These were things that were tested out in Latin America in particular, in Panama, as far as sanitation techniques and how to keep white Americans healthy and then kind of exported to the United States in order to keep out people that were viewed as unclean and to ensure that white Americans could stay healthy. So this was a major component of eugenics. This is also kind of the catalyst behind widespread sterilization of folks that were viewed as not possessing the right traits of fitness, right? Either like hereditary diseases or things that they didn't want being passed on to future generations. And this also took a very heavy gendered component as well. So sterilization of women. There was kind of a process where women could undergo counseling to promote more feminine traits. This was something where husbands could literally send their wives to a counselor saying that my wife isn't being feminine enough, like either doesn't want to have children with me, or she's not being affectionate enough. Please try to make her more feminine, more of a good, dutiful housewife. And these kind of counselors would do these sorts of things, right? And so this was kind of all of this together kind of was a bit of a nasty cocktail of ideas, right? But this was really, really super prevalent at the turn of the 20th century. Now, another kind of concept that was really prevalent at the turn of the 20th century was the idea of conservation. So during the late 19th century and early 20th century, we saw the creation of national park systems, particularly in settler colonies such as Australia, Canada, and the United States. And the rationale behind this was that with rapid industrialization, with the growth and the spread of farms and agriculture, there was a sense of fear that wild, quote, wild unspoiled lands would disappear and would be taken up by development. And there was a group of high-minded individuals, entrepreneurs and philanthropists, such as John Muir of Sierra Club fame, who said, well, we need to do what we can to save these sorts of spaces, right? So that we can preserve it for future generations, which is a common sentiment that we hear today, right? That we want to make sure that we are leaving a better earth for future generations, right? And so in places like Australia, Canada, and the United States, these national parks were developed. The first national park in the United States, of course, being Yellowstone in 1872, the first national park in Canada being Banff in the 1880s. And in the 1880s and 1890s, the creation of national parks, the first national parks in Australia and the Australian state of Queensland. Now, on its face, of course, this was viewed as a positive development, right? Where these governments, these states were creating these spaces for people to be able to go out and enjoy the great outdoors, right? Which is something I would imagine, and especially in a club like this, right, that you would all kind of empathize with. I mean, I know myself, if I really want to get away from it all, I can hop in my car and drive about an hour west of here to Port Renfrew, right, and go down to Juan de Fuca Provincial Park and be out right next to the Pacific Ocean. It's one of the best things in the world, and I haven't been in like 2 months, and I need to get back. Now, the problem behind this, there was a couple of problems behind this. One of the problems was that the construction of these parks, the creation of these parks oftentimes came through the severing of Indigenous relationships with these lands, right? And so in Australia in particular, folks would come through and they would put up fences around these parcels of land that were to become national parks. And the local Indigenous or Aboriginal peoples would try to come through these spaces in order to hunt or gather, and they would be stopped by park wardens, and they would say, well, why are you stopping us? And they would say, well, don't you see this is a park? You can't go and hunt in here, right? This is a space for conservation. The same thing with the United States. They would create parks on Indigenous land or land that was stolen from Indigenous peoples, but were still subject to treaties where Indigenous peoples had rights to hunt and fish and gather. And they would say, well, no, you're not doing that anymore, because if you kill off all the animals here, right, then there's going to be nothing for people to enjoy when they come into the parks. Same thing with Canada and our national parks up here. And so this was a clear interruptance of Indigenous relationships with the land, where essentially it was the idea, kind of the statement of like, we don't care what your relationships were before these, right? Don't you see that we're trying to preserve this land? It also was a bit of a whitewashing of kind of histories, right? Where that land had often been taken from Indigenous peoples through land theft. And so not only was that land stolen from them, then they were told that, well, you can't have a relationship with this land anymore, right? We took the land from you and promised that you could continue to do activities on it, but you can't do that anymore, because now we decided as a population that we're about conservation now, and that's what you need to be about as well. Another issue with this is that this fit into eugenicist ideals of providing space for white fitness and betterment. So folks like John Muir were not just being altruistic when they created these national parks. They weren't just saying, oh, well, you know, we want to do this out of the goodness of our hearts. They said, well, part of building a stronger white race is that we need to get out and we need to be fit, right? It's like these fit family contests. Like this was a period when like physical education and hygiene were huge courses in universities, right? The idea was like, you know how you raise a strong family? Well, you go out into these parks and you go spend time outside and you hike and you climb mountains and you spend time not breathing the dirty city air. And that is how you build up strong genes in order to pass them down to the next generation. So this is kind of the darker side behind, these spaces of conservation. That is not to say that national parks are a bad thing. As a matter of fact, particularly in Canada, we have a number of national parks now that are co-managed with Indigenous peoples. And I know that the National Park Service in the United States is slowly kind of moving towards that as well. And Minnesota in particular does a decent job, I think, in engaging with Indigenous peoples. I do know about the free park pass now that you can get if you're a native person from Minnesota. And I've also, probably one of my favorite state parks is Grand Portage State Park, that is actually co-run between the Grand Portage Band and the state of Minnesota. But there's still kind of a broader history that needs to be reckoned with. Okay. Now let's change gears a little bit and let's talk about kind of this broader concept of science and how it interfaces with Indigenous peoples beyond just conservation. So in the early 20th century and kind of before that, right, there was a prevailing thought in settler colonies in kind of broader dominant science that Indigenous peoples occupied a range of civilization, right? Where they had kind of moved past kind of the idea that we were all kind of one monolith, and they started to look at individual nations, individual bands, individual tribes, and they began to try to think, well, where are these different tribes as far as levels of civilization compared, of course, to European American ideals, as a way of kind of understanding, well, how much assimilation do they need to do in order to get up to our level of development? Some tribes, often ones that were militarily powerful or had strong economic links with settler culture, were viewed as more civilized than others, right? And this happened not only in the United States and in Canada, but really any place where there was colonization. There was kind of an idea that different non-European peoples kind of occupy different rungs of civilization. I'm looking up at a map that I have here in my office. There's an old map that was published back in the late 19th century called like a moral and political chart of the world. And it basically kind of took a look at the levels of quote morality and the levels of quote civilization that existed in different parts of the world. And kind of not surprisingly, Europe, or in places that had strong European influences, were viewed as highly moral, is highly civilized, and places that were not European are oftentimes viewed as immoral and uncivilized. So in regards to Indigenous peoples, some people argued that, well, Indigenous peoples are they're inherently part of nature, right? You know, when we found them, they were living in harmony with nature, and they were running around, they were running around naked and, we should view them as a part of nature, as part of the natural environment. And of course, I'm paraphrasing how these people viewed these sorts of things. But the idea was that, well, Indigenous peoples, they're inherently part of nature and they should be treated as such. And one of the biggest examples of this was back in Australia, particularly in the state of New South Wales. During the turn of the 20th century, there were these societies called Linnaean societies, which are of course named after Linnaeus, who developed kind of the taxonomical system of naming animals and plants that we, of course, observe today. And in these Linnaean societies, they would generally have these meetings where people would present on various animals and various plants that they had discovered and talk about kind of the scientific discovery and analysis of these things. Now, they also would from time to time bring in living Aboriginal peoples or Aboriginal remains, and they would talk about these Indigenous peoples too as if they were animals or as if they were plants, and kind of view them from an anthropological, ethnobotanical kind of scope, right? Talking about them as if they were kind of observing somebody clinically, right? Or as like a botanist out in the field taking field notes about what they observe. So this was one way of approaching this. Others said, well, this is the era of science, right? That we have these scientific techniques that we can use to determine how civilized these Indigenous peoples are. And so they turn to, in my mind, pseudoscientific ideals such as phrenology, which is again a pseudoscientific mode of study where you can try to determine the amount of intelligence somebody has by measuring their skull. And what do I mean by measuring their skull? Well, phrenologists would go and would find skulls. They would either grave rob Indigenous burials, or they would get hold of them through doctors or through crooked means. And they would take the skull and they would pour seeds, different kinds of seeds, into the skull. And they would basically say, oh, this skull holds this certain capacity of seeds. That clearly means that their brain cavity is larger or smaller, and therefore influences the size of their brain and therefore their intelligence. Now, besides the clear ethical quandary of robbing graves and trying to use skulls as essentially measuring tools, there was also kind of the deeply problematic aspect of the fact that usually in these sorts of measurements, they would almost invariably find that, oh yes, white Europeans, white Americans, white Canadians have bigger skulls, so therefore they have more intelligence than Indigenous peoples, than Black people, than anybody else, right? There's a book that I have here on my bookcase called Crania Americana by a fellow named Samuel Morton, who literally amassed skulls from around the world and literally wrote an entire book where he did this kind of study, right? I had to read it for my dissertation. It was like very, very ghastly stuff. And you might be thinking that like, oh, that's terrible, right? But that like clearly that kind of science doesn't exist anymore, right? Like clearly, the way that we interact with Indigenous peoples has to be better than that, right? Like we're not grave robbing and measuring their skulls, are we? Well, in a few slides, I'll talk to you about kind of the ways that this kind of stuff still goes on, right? But as we got into the 20th century, the relationship between dominant science and Indigenous peoples got worse, right? It didn't get better. So as we moved into the 20th century, as we moved into the late 20th century, we began to kind of embrace more high-tech forms of science, right? The development of a human genomic model was a huge quantum leap forward in scientific analysis, right? Because we could finally discover, well, where did humanity come from, right? How are we all connected to one another? And what does this mean for us as we continue to grow as a species? And so in the late 20th century, there was a series of anthropological and genomic projects that were designed to trace the histories of humanity, right? Things like the Human Genome Diversity Project or the Human Genome Project. There was a documentary that came out, oh God, probably 20 years ago, now called The Journey of Man by Spencer Wells, where he went around the communities and tried to, in this really slickly produced documentary, tried to figure out, well, where did humanity come from? These projects, while on their face, were portraying themselves as being helpful to humanity, right? We're also deeply problematic and fraught with Indigenous peoples, particularly the Human Genome Diversity Project. Because in order to find out, kind of our genetic makeup, in order to trace kind of the human genome, they would have to take blood samples from people to get genetic material. Other people would willingly do it, but they would get to Indigenous communities, particularly in the Amazon was one example that I read about, where the community would say, well, no, we don't want to do that. Why would we? Who are you? Why should we do this with you? And the researchers would kind of do kind of two forms of unethical behavior. One of them is that they would approach basically the chief of a village or the leader of a village and be like, do you give us consent in order to take blood samples from the people in the village? And usually like some money or, a bribe would change hands, and they'd be like, sure, go ahead and do it. And they would take that as consent over the consent of the individuals. Or when the leaders of the village would also not play ball and say, well, no, we're not going to do that. These researchers would then pay nurses and doctors that would go into these communities. They would pay them for the blood samples that they would take for a routine medical care and diagnostic tests in order to get access to that genetic material. And so Indigenous communities quickly kind of started to look at these projects and be like, well, like this is not on, right? This is not ethical. As well as kind of more problematic experiments and research projects closer to home, right? The example that we often hold up as being a key, clear-cut example of unethical behavior is the research that was done on the Ovasapai Nation by Arizona State University. Kind of the quick version of it is that researchers from Arizona State University approached the Ovasapai tribe in the late 80s and early 90s and said, we want to do research in order to find out if we can find genetic markers for diabetes, right? Similar to many American Indian communities, there's high rates of type 1 and type 2 diabetes on the Ovasapai Nation. And the Ovasapai said, okay, well, we consent to you coming in and taking blood samples from us in order to find out if there are genetic markers for diabetes that we can see so that we might be able to diagnose, either the disease or identify people that are at risk of it from an early age and do what we can to promote more healthy habits to try to stall the growth of type 2 diabetes in our community, or type 1 and type 2. Well, these researchers from Arizona State University took the blood samples and brought them back to Tempe and carried out the research, but then they weren't releasing the results to the Ovasapai, and the Ovasapai were kind of wondering, well, what's going on, right? We consented to do this research. We want to know what's going on. And then word came out that these researchers were not only trying to research genetic causes of diabetes or genetic markers, they were also studying these genetic samples for dementia, for Alzheimer's, for other sorts of things. And they were sharing the data that they were collecting with researchers that were not part of the project and researchers that were outside of Arizona State University completely. And the Ovasapai Nation found out about this and they said, well, hold on a second. We didn't consent to doing research on Alzheimer's or dementia, and we certainly didn't consent to you sharing our data, our genetic material with other people that we don't know. And so there was a lawsuit that got launched. The Ovasapai won the lawsuit and basically got all of the blood samples back from Arizona State University. And the Ovasapai Nation turned around and said, well, you know what? Because you couldn't behave ethically, now no researcher from Arizona State University is allowed to set foot on a reservation to do work. And that lasted for nearly 20 years. As a matter of fact, a good friend of mine, Crystal Sosi, who is a Dene geneticist who works down at Arizona State University. She was the first researcher from ASU that was allowed back onto the Vasapai Nation a couple of years ago, right? And it took an indigenous geneticist in order for that nation to trust an institution enough to allow them to come back, right? And this has also led to a lot of nations kind of now instituting institutional review boards and kind of coming up with really strong ethical processes to govern work that's being done, right? If you were to ask the folks at Arizona State University, they'd be like, well, we maybe made missteps, right? But we're carrying out science. If you were to ask Spencer Wells and the Human Genome Diversity Project, they'd say, we're just trying to do science. If you were to go back to the era of phrenology, or the era of eugenics, they'd say, well, this is scientific, right? We're just trying to do science. So in the present day, right, there are these questions that face Indigenous peoples when it comes to, quote, science, right? Questions surrounding biological diversity in the face of climate and environmental change. Like, what's going to happen to the environment? What's going to happen to plants, animals, birds, fish, water, air, right? As we enter a climate crisis. We have, we are reaching a stage where increasing numbers of Indigenous peoples are entering the academy and starting to do what we would consider to be science, right? Now we have organizations like the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, or ASIS, that have a number of really awesome students that are starting to enter into academic structures, into scientific structures, and trying to do science. And we see these debates over, well, what exactly is science, right? Is Indigenous science valid? Are Indigenous ways of doing science, of creating knowledge, valid and worthy of study and visibility in the academy? It's a really controversial thing. I used to be really active on Twitter. I'm actually now back on Twitter. And back when I was really active, a couple of years ago, one of the best ways to start an argument on Twitter would be to say, well, Indigenous science is science. And then I would have a lot of racist people in the comments saying, well, what do you mean Indigenous science? Like, you guys were dancing around naked, worshiping the sun and sacrificing people and like praying to trees, right? That's not scientific. Like, these just deeply problematic racist things. And I'm like, nope, that's not true. And that's not Indigenous science, right? As a matter of fact, nowadays, a lot of people have come around to the idea of Indigenous science. I have to laugh every time I see like this grant of non-Native people getting, or this team of non-Native people getting $1 million grant to do things like, oh, we're studying fire management techniques, right? Because to prevent wildfires. And they win win a $2 million grant, and they're doing all this work. They get a book, they get publications, they get news media coverage, and then it'll usually come out a little bit later that an Indigenous community will be like, well, like we've been doing that for like 200 years. Like, you took that knowledge from our community, right? When we talked about it, you said, oh, well, that's silly, that's not scientific. But then when it comes time for you to get money and clout out of it, then all of a sudden it's a valid scientific technique, right? So that's kind of some debates that are raging. Another debate centers around controversy surrounding repatriation. And sorry, I will say this is going to be the slide here where I kind of talk about Indigenous death a little bit. And so one of the things, right, is there's been this long history of Indigenous remains being held by institutions and museums to be studied and displayed, where people would come across Indigenous skeletons, Indigenous remains, Indigenous artifacts, through grave robbing, through people kind of keeping them as collectibles or souvenirs, right? And they would end up in museums and they would be kind of studied as objects of curiosity. Probably one of the well-known local examples in Minnesota was the fact that the Mayo Clinic held onto the remains of a Dakota man, one of the 38 that were hanged at Mankato back in 1862. His remains were held by one of the founders of the Mayo Clinic, William Worrell Mayo, and then his sons, and then the Mayo Clinic for 138 years before they were finally returned to his family, right? So this is just one example. I know that the Weissman Art Museum at the University of Minnesota has identified a collection of Indigenous artifacts and remains there that they're working with local nations to try to repatriate. I know the University of North Dakota has their kind of own negotiation processes with Indigenous nations there in North Dakota. That's to say nothing of the other museums and other private collections that have been there. Now, these are supposed to be repatriated. There is a Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, which basically said that there's now a legal framework of consultation, and that these institutions are supposed to identify these sources and return them to the nations that they belong to. And this process is uneven, right? Where there are questions like, well, what happens if they come from a nation that isn't around anymore? Or like, why do we need to return these to Indigenous peoples, right? Like, don't they believe in science? Don't they understand that we're trying to do good work with this? And so it's institutions kind of delay handing them off. I see something here in the chat. Looks like a book recommendation there. There's even backlash from some sections of academia surrounding repatriation in the name of academic freedom. This book right here on the right-hand side on repatriation and erasing the past by Elizabeth Weiss and James W. Springer is such a book. And the only reason I'm giving it any kind of coverage here is because this is a prime example of why laws like NAGPRA exist in the first place, where essentially these folks kind of say, well, Indigenous peoples aren't scientific, right? They have no history of science production. And when they ask for remains back, when they try to stifle academic research, what they're doing is they're making it more difficult for us to do important work. So therefore, Indigenous peoples are anti-science. That's literally the point of the book. I wrote a book review about it where I kind of pushed back against some. That was one of the few times that I was like, I need to write a review about that book because it is so incredibly problematic. But that narrative exists, right? And so what do we do about this? What does this look like to push back against these modes of dominant science? Well, part of this kind of comes around consent and consultation with Indigenous peoples in science and natural sciences, right? So nowadays, fortunately, there is more commitment to making sure that Indigenous nations are fully informed and consent to work being done on their lands and with their people, right? Where at universities in particular, like particularly here at UVic, you do anything with an Indigenous nation, you are very heavily vetted before you do so, both by the community as well as by the university. Myself in my lab, a student won't do any research in an Indigenous community until they understand like what it means to do ethical research and until we've had a conversation with the community and have gotten their input, right? And so that's one really, really positive development. Second positive development has really been increased attention to different ways of knowing and being, right? The understanding that there are different ontologies, there are different ways of understanding the world and of doing, quote, science. And we need to recognize the diversity of those ways and the recognition of the fact that Indigenous peoples, well, we are scientists, right? One of the things that I do is I do work, of course, as I mentioned, on kind of environmental change with climate change. And for myself at my own nation at Leech Lake, I really like our folks in our aquatic biology kind of program because sometimes I think they are probably as smart as folks that have PhDs in the field, right? Where they understand like the life cycle of fish, they understand like how to promote cleaner waters. A lot of really, really cool work that's done. And it's by folks that maybe have a bachelor's degree at best, but what they're doing is they're taking their knowledge of community and they're taking knowledge that's been passed down by our ancestors and applying it in really, really cool ways, right? There are so many different examples of the example I mentioned before, where somebody will come up with this new kind of scientific development and people will hail it as like, this is like a wonderful new advancement in science. And then an Indigenous community will say, well, we've been doing that for generations, right, for millennia. So it's not new to us. Like we knew that was a thing, right? I want to here are just a couple of slides up. I want to show a short video here of the first. This is of a really awesome mentor of mine named Max Liberot, who is a Métis scholar, one of the Indigenous peoples of Canada, who works at the Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador, and I'm hoping that this will play. They run a lab called CLEAR, which is a marine plastics lab based out of the Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador, who really have tackled this question of like how to do science, who benefits from science, and what does it mean to do a more equitable form of science. And so I'll show this video for a few minutes. I have one more slide and then we'll wrap up.
I like to work on impossible problems to find out what makes them impossible, because if you find out what makes a problem impossible, you find out where its leverage points are to change what the world is like to make it feasible to solve. My name is Dr. Max Liberot, and I study plastic pollution. I was researching garbage crises through history and how people overcame them when they thought there was an insurmountable, impossible to solve problem. So 1880s New York City garbage couldn't be done, right? Then it was done. Someone said, oh, are you going to look at plastic pollution in the oceans as one of your case studies? And I said, no, because it's actually impossible to solve. And I thought about that for a few days and changed my entire career trajectory. So I only work on that problem now. There's a couple of things. It's a scientific laboratory where we study marine plastic pollution, but it's also an incubator for feminist and anti-colonial methods. And those two things come together and we form a research collective. All research, no matter what kind of research, has values. The thing about CLEAR is that we are very self-conscious and reflexive about our values. And instead of choosing, say, prestige and giant grants as our main goals, we choose humility and equity and a commitment to land as our goals. We're looking at plastic in snow, in water, in fish, in birds, in everything they eat, in air, on their shorelines, in their water. Just constant monitoring of plastic in the province so we can sort of see the shape of the problem. We created a bunch of accessible, do-it-yourself, kitchen tool sort of surface water trawl. We made the lady trawl, which is about $500 and smaller, and you can make it with things you find in your garage. And then we did baby legs, which is about $8, made with soda pop bottles and baby tights, and like kids can use it, and it still collects data. I want to change the future of science, how science is done by who. So open access science, open access tools, humility. We have more trans and gender minorities in our lab than any other lab. We have Indigenous folks, we have children, we have elders, right? Those folks making science is the sort of change we're looking to make with tools that they can use when they don't have grants and don't have a university. Everybody's a researcher. Children are researchers. They learn about the world, they gather information systematically, they make theories about how the world works, they test them, and off they go, right? The main role of mentorship in the lab is teaching people about ways of being and ways of doing, so that no matter what they get off to, whether it's plastic pollution research or government work or teaching or being a parent, they have skills about doing things in a good way. I set up what I would call sandboxes. So I lay out some parameters and then the students go in it and they do whatever they're going to do. They fail together, they succeed together, they work out the problems together. I don't teach content, I teach people how to be, how to problem solve, how to be humble. CLEAR operates on the premises that everyone knows more than we do, including undergraduates, including community members, including plastics themselves. And we're here to learn from them and to put all that knowledge on the table in a coordinated fashion so we can co-learn. We do not mobilize knowledge. We try and gain knowledge and say back what we have learned. We produce knowledge for people who have already asked for that knowledge. So the very first season that I came to this province and I looked in some cod for plastic because I thought that would be a good idea. So I called a community meeting in a fishing village to be like, what does this mean? Will this cause harm? And in that meeting, people asked me questions that I couldn't answer. Those became my research questions for the next couple of years. I would then go back to those communities, present those results, and they would ask me new questions. And I'm always working on community questions. We have to listen and listen and listen. We then do what those folks say and tell us to do, and we give it and we say, is this right? It's a very different model of how knowledge flows. We don't own the data or the knowledge that we collect from Indigenous lands. Indigenous folks own that. We are temporary sort of custodians of that data, and we always give it back, and that is part of Indigenous law. Everyone, every culture, every age group, every gender knows things, and they know it from one perspective and not other perspectives. And that includes scientists who know things from one perspective and not other perspectives. There's a thing called feminist standpoint theory. And the very easy way to understand it is if you have an object, you can see it from this angle and maybe from this angle, but you need someone over here and over there and from all the different angles. And so by increasing the types of people and types of knowledge in a research endeavor, you can actually do science and other forms of knowledge better. how many plastics is often an end result, but it's the how we got there. That's where my stakes and my interests are. That's where the mentoring happens. That's where the co-learning happens. Are we changing how science is done? Are we securing different futures for what science might look like? That's the impact we're looking to have. If we also change plastic policy, bingo. The impossible problem things. I like to work on impossible problems because it means I can find what makes it impossible and change it.
Right. So Max is a huge hero of mine. I actually was a member of the Clear Lab for nearly 3 years. And so I'd log on to our Zoom meetings every morning. They were 7:30 in the morning here in BC. I was actually I made the joke that I had never actually set foot in the Clear Lab until I actually did this last April. I flew out to St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, and actually got to see the lab right as I was leaving the lab. But it's a major inspiration for like how I started my lab, right? And we tackle kind of the same kind of issues, right? I tend to be somebody, I'm like, you know, things are impossible until you just find a different way of trying to solve them, right? If something is impossible, then you break it down and you try to find the smaller things that you can solve, and then that leads you to this bigger problem, right? And you know, we focus really heavily on like consultation with communities and putting their needs first. And so just a really awesome way of kind of reframing how science is being done, right? It's kind of based out of this idea of Indigenous knowledge and based out of upholding kind of the knowledge that is held in communities. And so I want to end with kind of one more kind of anecdote here, and then kind of this last slide. And so probably one of the best scientific talks that I'd ever been to was at a National Science Foundation workshop that I attended down in Lawrence, Kansas at Haskell Indian Nations University back in the fall of 2018. And I had applied and gotten into this program that was called Mentoring Our Own Native Scientists, or Moons. And the idea was that it was bringing these Native scholars together in order to try to figure out what we needed in order to make an impact in the world of science. And we sat together. Actually, as a matter of fact, we kind of practiced writing a number of NSF grants. And on one of the final nights, we went to a talk at the University of Kansas. And by this fellow pictured on the right, Ed Galindo, who is a Yaqui scholar. And he started out, he told this interesting talk. And he started out by telling us about the idea of the trickster, which the trickster is kind of a concept that is common among many different Indigenous nations, including Ojibwe folks, where the trickster is a being that can shift form and can fool people and can kind of, basically the idea is that the trickster will, you know, you might have an idea of what the trickster is or who they are, and then they will change on you at the drop of a hat, right? And so they're constantly shifting their identity and who they are in order to fit into given spaces or in order to make space for themselves. And so he starts out by talking about that, and then he talks about how he did this project with his own community around tagging beavers with the youth. And he says, you know, I got this money to go into my community and I teach these students how to tag beaver and how to identify them. And we spend the summer doing that. And he's talking about all these different, like, you know, anatomical terms and biological terms. And I'm like, well, this is kind of interesting. Like, this isn't really in my wheelhouse, but like, this is fascinating. And I was listening, and then about halfway to 3/4 of the way through the talk, I all of a sudden realized that Ed had subtly shifted what he was talking about, where he was no longer talking about this straightforward biology project where they were tagging beaver and identifying them, but instead he was starting to talk about things like identity and language and culture, and about how he was teaching the youth in his community these sorts of things through this project. And then I was completely hooked. I was like, oh my gosh, you've tricked us all, right? You are the trickster here. You are basically telling us the ways in which Indigenous culture itself can be scientific. And then I've never looked back ever since, right? When I do the work that I do, when I do scientific work, right, I always hold my own Ojibwe values with me. And I say, well, these sorts of things influence how we see the world, right? And they are scientific on their own. So when we talk about what comes next, really, we're seeing the increased opportunities for Indigenous students to enter scientific spaces, right? Indigenous science is now definitely a thing, and it is something that the door is getting kicked open by our generation for future generations to step into. We are seeing the promotion of the visibility of Indigenous science as a primary knowledge source. I did a podcast with the Three Rivers Park District a year ago, right? And I think it just came out where we talked about kind of, relationships to land, right, in the Twin Cities, and how more Dakota, kind of ways of relating to the land are being embraced. And we're seeing the continued consultation and repatriation of materials, both from a scientific standpoint and from an anthropological standpoint, to Indigenous peoples from educational institutions, right? And so my hope is, for the future, right, is that Indigenous science can get to the point where we don't always have to just say, well, Indigenous science needs to have a space as well, but we can just recognize it as being part of science as well. All right, I've talked to your ear off enough. Thank you so much, Niiyokamigaabaw. Here's my contact information here if you want to get a hold of me after this talk. But of course, now we have, I think, a little bit of time for